In the fall of 2019, a woman named Sarah Whitfield stood at the edge of 28 acres of land, so overtaken by wild grapevine that you couldn't see the ground beneath it. Land the bank was one signature away from selling out from under her family for good. She'd spent every dollar she had left just to save it. She had no idea that buried somewhere under that tangle of vines was a secret nearly 100 years old, one that her own grandfather had known about and never told a soul. It would take a herd of pigs, 3 days of rooting through packed clay soil, and one very confused excavator driver to finally bring it into the light. What they found wasn't treasure. It wasn't gold. It was something stranger, older, and far more dangerous to the family that had once owned this land than anyone could have guessed. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly why some families bury their secrets instead of their money, and what it costs when the ground finally gives them back. If you're new here, welcome to the Rural Files, where we tell the true-to-life stories of the land, the people who worked it, and the history that never really stays buried. Hit subscribe before we start, because this one has a twist you will not see coming. Sarah Whitfield never expected to be fighting for a piece of land she'd spent most of her childhood trying to get away from. She grew up on the Whitfield family farm in the hill country, 28 acres that had been in her family for 4 generations, tucked into a fold of land where the ridges rose steep enough that half the property had never been worth farming in any conventional sense. Her grandfather, Earl Whitfield, had raised hogs and a little tobacco on the flat bottomland near the creek, same as his father before him. Sarah's own father had taken the place over in the 70s, run it down slowly through years of bad decisions and worse luck, and by the time Sarah was 18, she'd made up her mind to leave the hill country behind and never look back. She built a life in the city. Marketing job, a condo, a routine that had nothing to do with hogs or hay or the particular exhaustion of farm labor. For almost 20 years, she barely thought about the old place at all, beyond the obligatory holiday visits to see her aging parents. Then her father passed in 2016, and 2 years later her mother followed him, and Sarah found herself the sole owner of 28 acres of hill country land that nobody in the family had properly worked in over a decade. The place had gone wild in that time. Without livestock to keep it grazed down, and without anyone tending the fence lines, the wild grapevine that had always grown thick along the creek bottom had spread up the hillsides and swallowed whole sections of pasture. Entire outbuildings disappeared under it. The old hog barn her grandfather built by hand in the 1950s was barely visible as anything more than a green, leafy hill. Sarah tried for a while to manage it from a distance. She hired a local property manager to keep the taxes paid and the worst of the brush cleared. But property management is expensive, distant ownership is inefficient, and grief has a way of making people put off decisions they should be making. 2 years slipped by, then 3. By the time Sarah opened the certified letter from the county in the spring of 2019, she owed back taxes she hadn't fully understood were accumulating, on a property she hadn't seen in person in nearly 3 years. The letter used a word she'd never expected to see attached to her family's name: foreclosure. The county was prepared to auction the land to satisfy the tax debt. Sarah had 90 days to either pay what was owed in full or lose the last piece of her family that still existed outside of memory. Sarah did the math more times than she wanted to admit that spring. Her condo, her savings, a loan against her retirement account she swore she'd never touch. It took every resource she had, and a level of financial risk that terrified her. But by July of 2019, Sarah Whitfield had paid off the back taxes in full and become, for the first time in her adult life, the actual working owner of the Whitfield family land. She didn't have a plan beyond saving it. She just knew that losing it, losing the last physical proof that 4 generations of her family had stood on that ground, wasn't something she could live with. The problem was that saving the land on paper and actually reclaiming 28 acres of aggressive wild grapevine were 2 very different challenges. Sarah drove out that August to see, in person, exactly what she now owned, and the sight of it nearly broke her resolve completely. The vine had done more than climb fences. It had consumed them. Sarah walked what she thought was the old fence line along the eastern edge of the property and realized, 20 minutes in, that she was standing on top of it. The wire and posts buried somewhere beneath a solid mat of green that had grown so dense in places it held her weight like a spongy, uneven floor. Whole trees along the creek bottom had been strangled and killed, their bare branches jutting up through a blanket of leaves like skeletons reaching for daylight. Her grandfather's hog barn, the building where Earl Whitfield had raised pigs for 40 years, was completely gone from view, just a mounded green hill where a structure used to be. A local land clearing company gave her a quote to bulldoze and burn the worst of it that would have eaten through most of what little money she had left. A more careful, low-impact clearing approach would take even longer and cost more. It was an old-timer at the feed store in town, a man who'd known her grandfather, who gave Sarah the idea that would end up changing everything. "Get yourself some hogs," he told her. "Vine like that. Hogs'll root it right out of the ground. Your granddaddy always said pigs'll do in a season what a man with a brush hog does in 3. Sarah laughed at first. It sounded almost too simple, too old-fashioned a solution for a problem that had felt so overwhelming. But she was out of easy options and running low on money, and there was something that felt right, almost like a kind of homecoming, about the idea of putting hogs back on ground where her grandfather had raised them for 40 years. By September, Sarah had 6 feeder pigs delivered to a temporary pen near the old creek bottom, on the section of land where the vine grew thickest, closest to where the hog barn used to stand. Now, Sarah had no idea, when she turned those 6 pigs loose on that patch of ground, that she was about to set in motion a discovery that would completely change how she understood her own grandfather, a man she'd loved her whole life and thought she knew everything about. What those pigs found underneath that vine wasn't going to be simple, and it wasn't going to be comfortable. If you've ever found out something about your own family that changed the way you saw them, I want to hear about it in the comments, because that's exactly what happened to Sarah, and we're about to get into it. Pigs are extraordinary land-clearing animals, and anyone who has ever kept hogs on overgrown ground will tell you the same thing. Their instinct to root through soil in search of roots, grubs, and anything edible underneath the surface makes them far more effective than heavy machinery at exposing what's actually there, without the destructive force of a bulldozer blade tearing through everything indiscriminately. Within the first week, Sarah's 6 pigs had made visible progress on the thickest mat of vine near the creek bottom, rooting and trampling their way through ground that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade. Sarah drove out every weekend to check on them, and every weekend, more of the old landscape started reappearing. The outline of an old fence post here, a rusted piece of farm equipment there, the vague suggestion of where the hog barn's foundation had once stood. It was on the 3rd weekend, in early October, that Sarah noticed something different about the pigs' behavior near the northeast corner of the old barn foundation. Instead of moving on the way they normally did, once an area was rooted through, all 6 animals kept circling back to the same 6-foot patch of ground, digging with a persistence that seemed almost deliberate. Sarah walked over to see what had them so fixated, and found a section of packed clay soil that felt harder and more uniform than the ground around it. Almost like there was something solid just beneath the surface that the pigs could sense but couldn't quite root through on their own. She called the same old-timer from the feed store, who suggested she might have hit an old cistern or root cellar, common enough on hill country farms of that era, used for keeping food cool before refrigeration was standard. Curious more than concerned, Sarah rented a small excavator the following weekend, and, working carefully, began peeling back the packed clay layer by layer. What she found, roughly 3 feet down, wasn't a root cellar. It was a low, hand-built stone and brick structure, maybe 8 feet across, with a rusted iron door still hanging on corroded hinges. Inside, once the excavator operator helped Sarah clear enough debris to see, was unmistakable, a copper still, remarkably intact despite decades underground, along with dozens of glass jugs, coiled copper tubing, and a collection of rusted metal drums that had clearly once held something far stronger than water. Sarah stood at the edge of that hole in stunned silence. Her grandfather, Earl Whitfield, the man who'd raised hogs and tobacco and gone to church every Sunday of his life as far as Sarah knew, had apparently once run, or at the very least, hidden, a moonshine still directly beneath the ground where his hog barn stood. Sarah spent the next several weeks doing what she could to understand what she'd actually found, and the story that emerged, pieced together from county historical records, an elderly cousin's memory, and a conversation with a local historian who specialized in Prohibition-era hill country history, was more complicated and more human than Sarah could have imagined. Earl Whitfield had been a young man during the final years of Prohibition in the early 1930s, farming hill country land that had never been especially profitable for legitimate crops. Like a significant number of families in that region during that era, the Whitfields had turned to moonshining as a way to survive years when tobacco prices collapsed, and legal farming income simply wasn't enough to keep a family fed. The historian explained that hill country stills from that period were often built exactly the way Sarah had found this one, partially underground, disguised beneath outbuildings like hog barns and corn cribs, specifically to avoid detection during federal raids that swept through the region with some regularity in those years. A hog barn was a particularly clever choice of cover. The smell of livestock helped mask the distinctive odor of a working still, and the presence of pigs rooting around the property gave federal agents less reason to suspect anything buried beneath it. Earl Whitfield had apparently run that operation for a handful of years, right up until Prohibition's repeal in 1933 made the entire enterprise unnecessary and, more importantly, unprofitable compared to going legitimate. Rather than risk anyone finding the still and connecting his family to activity that could have still carried social and legal consequences even after repeal, records suggest state-level restrictions lingered in parts of the region for years afterward. Earl had simply sealed the space, built his permanent hog barn directly over top of it, and never spoke of it again to anyone in the family. Sarah's elderly cousin, Earl's niece, was the only living relative who remembered hearing anything about it at all. A single offhand comment her own mother had made decades earlier about what your Uncle Earl got up to before the war. A comment that had never been explained and that nobody had thought to ask more about before the people who knew the full story had passed away. Sarah sat with that history for a long time. It complicated her memory of her grandfather in ways she hadn't expected, not because she felt ashamed of what he'd done, but because it meant the man she'd known her whole life had carried an entire chapter of his own history in complete silence, choosing to bury it rather than let it become part of how his family understood him. The more Sarah learned, though, the more she found herself understanding his choice rather than judging it. Earl Whitfield had been a young man trying to keep his family fed during one of the hardest economic stretches in American history, using the only resource he had access to on land that had never given him an easy living. He'd broken the law, but he'd done it to survive, and when the law changed and the risk was no longer worth the reward, he'd simply closed that chapter completely and spent the rest of his life being the version of himself his family actually knew. A steady, hard-working farmer who went to church every Sunday and raised hogs on the same ground where he'd once hidden something he never wanted anyone to find. Sarah made the decision, after talking it over with the local historian, to preserve rather than remove what the pigs had uncovered. The still itself was carefully documented and, with permission from the County Historical Society, partially restored as a small, respectful exhibit on the property. Not to glorify moonshining, but to honor an authentic piece of hill country history that very few physical examples of still exist intact today. She built a small covered structure over the excavated site, protecting it from the elements, with a modest plaque explaining what the site was, and the economic circumstances that led families like the Whitfields to operations like this one during Prohibition. She kept a handful of the original jugs and copper tubing on display, alongside a photograph of Earl Whitfield from the 1930s that Sarah's cousin had contributed, a young man in overalls, standing in front of a hog barn, giving no hint at all of the secret directly beneath his boots. The pigs, meanwhile, finished the job they'd started. Over that first winter and into the following spring, Sarah's small herd rooted and cleared nearly the entire 28 acres of aggressive wild grapevine, exposing fence lines, old farm equipment, and the true shape of land that hadn't been visible in over a decade. What had been an overwhelming, foreclosure-threatened tangle of vine when Sarah first drove out to see it had become, within a single year, workable pasture again. The same ground her grandfather had once farmed, now visible and usable for the first time in a generation. Sarah didn't move back to the hill country permanently, but she started coming out most weekends, expanding her small hog operation, slowly restoring the old farmhouse her grandmother had once kept, and building something that felt less like preserving the past and more like continuing it. Local news outlets picked up the story of the buried still not long after Sarah opened the small exhibit, and visitors began making the trip out to see a genuine, intact piece of Prohibition-era hill country history. Something historians in the area confirmed was increasingly rare to find, still standing in any recognizable form. Standing at the site now, visitors can see both halves of Earl Whitfield's story side by side. The hog barn foundation, where he raised the animals everyone in the family remembered him for, and directly beneath it, the still he never told a single soul about. Two truths that coexisted in one man, on one piece of ground, for the better part of a century, until a herd of pigs and a granddaughter who refused to let the land go finally brought them both into the light at the same time. Sarah Whitfield still owns those 28 acres today, and she'll tell anyone who asks that saving that land cost her more than she ever expected it to. Not just financially, but in the sense that it forced her to reckon with a version of her family's history she never knew existed. But she'll also tell you she wouldn't trade what she learned for anything, because the version of her grandfather she understands now is more complete, more human, and in some ways more admirable than the simple, steady farmer she thought she knew her whole life. That's the thing about land that's been in a family for generations. It doesn't just hold memories. Sometimes it holds the things families chose not to remember at all, until something or someone finally brings it back to the surface. That's the kind of story we tell here on the Rural Files. The ones about the land, the families who worked it, and the histories that never really disappear, no matter how deep they get buried. If this story caught you off guard the way it caught Sarah off guard, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one. We've got stories coming that will completely change the way you look at rural life or a quiet field. Drop a comment and tell me if your own family has ever uncovered something from the past that changed the way you saw them. And if you've got a story about land, history, or family secrets that came back to the surface, I want to hear it, because that's exactly what this channel is here for. Thank you for spending this time with us. We'll see you in the next one.